Welcome to Interview from Mexico. I'm Laura Carlson, and I'll be your host as we look at cutting-edge issues from art to politics here on Telesur. Today we're going to be talking to award-winning author Jennifer Clement. A novelist and a poet, Jennifer frequently brings social issues and human rights into her novels, such as the most recent book on a victim of sex trafficking here in Mexico. This raises the question of what is the role of literature in making social change and in holding a mirror up to society.
I wanted to smell his neck and place my mouth on his mouth and taste him and hold him. I wanted to smell the smell of garden and grass and palm tree, smell of rose and leaf and lemon flower. I fell in love with Julio the gardener, and his name was Julio. I spent the morning following him around the garden. He trimmed, dug, and cut. He rubbed the leaves of a lemon tree between his fingers and smelled them. He took a few flat silver seeds out of the back pocket of his jeans and pressed them into the dirt.
Welcome, Jennifer Clement, to Interview from Mexico, and thank you so much for joining us here in the Octavio Paz Library in Mexico City. Jennifer, I wanted to start out, your work has focused a lot on the hidden side of Mexican society. You have the domestic workers and now most recently women victims of sex trafficking. What are the criteria you use to choose your subjects, and why this particular focus?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me on this program, and it's a great honor to be in the Octavio Paz bookstore in Mexico City. I guess, you know, it's hard to say exactly what makes me exactly choose a theme, but what I've been able to see now, because I have enough works that I'm able to sort of look at them and understand what I'm doing more deeply than just sort of intuitively, is I seem to be very attracted to the world of the unprotected, sort of in general. So in the cases that you mentioned, they happen to be books about Mexico, but I've also written books that take place in other countries, even books that take place in history. And somehow I'm always touching on the unprotected in some way or another. So the two books that you mentioned, A True Story Based on Lies, is about the mistreatment of servants and the abuse of servants in Mexico. And this recent book is about the trafficking of young girls in the state of Guerrero in Mexico.
So both of these books, and I think some of the others as well, have a strong focus also on human rights. How do you use literature to promote human rights in this way?
Well, you know, I had never seen myself actually that way, and it wasn't until I won a humanitarian award for this last book, Prayers for the Stolen, and it made me sort of reflect on, well, what is the role of human rights in literature? And actually, it has an enormous role in human rights. I mean, if one thinks of books like Oliver Twist, I mean, that book helped to change the child labor laws, or a book like Jane Eyre, or the books of Jane Austen, which have to do with the rights of women to hold property. And the novels of Charlotte Bronte and of Jane Austen showed the consequences of the fact that women couldn't earn a living and couldn't own property. And then, of course, if one looks at the French tradition, there are the books by Zola, Émile Zola, that have to do a lot with issues to do with human rights, or Victor Hugo. So there's actually a great tradition of books, you know, novels discussing problems in society.
Well, you mentioned women's rights, and of course both these books are focused on women in particular. Do you see a particular need or attraction to the area of women's rights, especially in this Mexican context?
Yeah, I think I do. I mean, there are certain things that just shock me so much, and the thing that I've also learned with this new book, Prayers for the Stolen, because it's had an extraordinary reception in the world. It's been bought all over the world. I've had to travel everywhere with this book. And what I've realized is that even though it's very much a particularly Mexican story, and more so now in a way with everything that's happening in the state of Guerrero today, but the truth is that this is happening all over the world. And so the women may be dressed differently, they may be a different color, they may be eating different kinds of food, and they may speak a different language. But the fact that women have no value is a problem absolutely everywhere, even in countries like the United States.
Oh yeah, it's one of the biggest markets in many ways for this. And when you talk about the unprotected, of course, women in a macho society and even worldwide are certainly still fall in that class way too frequently. Well, you know, I write nonfiction, and you write fiction, and fiction is always based on stories, and oftentimes more personal stories, and oftentimes, as you mentioned, linking to social issues. But even in nonfiction, we find that more and more people are encouraging us, you know, to tell the stories. What do you think the power of a story is in raising social awareness?
Well, I think, first of all, there's sort of two sides to that. I mean, one of the things that I have realized, and maybe you have found this too, is that everybody wants to tell their story. So that's sort of one side of that, because so many people have asked me, how do you get people to talk to you? And it's because people want to tell their story. And then the other side of it is that when you tell a story, you put the human condition is expressed in a way where compassion can enter. So when you just have statistics or very cold reports on, you know, figures of how many girls are being trafficked, it doesn't have the same impact as when you read a novel and maybe you fall madly in love with these girls, and so you care about them, and so you care about their fate.
Yeah, I think that's the big difference, you know, the image of a real person going through this, especially when people are bombarded with issues and with bad news and with the news in sound bites and that kind of thing. I've found that there's a big difference. But another one of the things that I've seen that I want to ask you about is when people do give you their stories and you share their tears, I don't know, I mean, it makes you feel a tremendous amount of responsibility. How do you deal with it? And it also can kind of impact you emotionally, I would imagine.
Yeah, it's funny. Like you, when I've spoken to people who are journalists who have gone into the field, I mean, I always go into the field really from the point of view of a poet. I'm looking for the poetic experience as opposed to the journalistic experience, or the experience that a politician might look for, or a lawyer might look for, or somebody working in an NGO might look for. I'm looking for the poetry of the experience. But what I have found in talking to all kinds of people that go into the field and talk to people and hear these stories is, and it's funny because so many people outside will say, were you afraid? But those of us who are inside, like the two of us, or other journalists who are covering this, or writers, or lawyers, or politicians, is that one's outrage is always greater than one's fear. And so that is the sort of, I think, the seed for people that go in and write about this, is that your outrage is always the strongest feeling.
Well, Jennifer, I want to come back to that and the process of researching and writing these books in just a minute. We'll take a short pause and we'll be right back.
He used long shears to cut the grass. After an hour, he left and went to get a ladder from the garage so that he could cut the Mexican pink bougainvillea that grew along one wall and beside the life-sized bronze horse. As he snipped the overgrown branches, yellow pollen was shaken into the air, and the flowers, like paper flowers, covered the ground. Julio was in his early 20s. His skin was deeply tanned from working in the sun all day. He had a short afro that stood up like a black crown above him and light brown eyes.
We're back with Jennifer Clement talking about her work and her latest book, Prayers for the Stolen, on sex trafficking of women here in Mexico. Jennifer, I know that for this book in particular, you had to do a lot of research, and that research included talking to the women themselves. Can you describe that process a little bit?
Sure. Well, I sort of see that process as being sort of, it took almost 11 years, and it was sort of in 4 different stages. So the first stage was talking to women in hiding, and some were women of drug traffickers that were in hiding. And then that work became too dangerous because with the escalation of the war against drugs, in fact, the whole country, sort of the tone in the country changed, and this was when journalists started to be killed and the numbers of people being killed in general all over the country started to escalate. So at that moment, I became the president of PEN Mexico, and I was president of PEN for 3 years, and those 3 years I literally had to just completely dedicate myself to the problem of the killing of journalists in Mexico. So that even also took me to rural parts of Mexico as well. And then after I stopped being president, because it's a 3-year term, I did quite a bit of research in Guerrero itself, talking to women, you know, be they waitresses or sellers of, you know, blouses and necklaces on the beach, or women that worked as cleaning ladies in the hotels. So there would be women that lived in that area. And this was in Acapulco, for example, but I also went to Chilpancingo and spoke to women there. So just sort of and then also to some women who are from Barranca Dulce. And it was those women who told me, very, very poor communities, how drug traffickers would come into their communities and steal their young girls. And they explained to me that what they would do is dig holes in the cornfields and hide their girls in these holes. So actually that was the image that gave birth to the novel. So that would have been the 3rd stage of the research. And then the 4th stage was the time I spent at the women's jail in Mexico City, which was very interesting because I met women, you know, who had been the women of drug traffickers, or women who had been trafficked sexually, or women who had committed petty crimes. I met, you know, a whole range of women in that situation. So those would be sort of like the 4 stages. And I didn't know when I was doing this that I was going to write this book, except when I heard about the holes. That was an image that didn't let me go. And then another thing that affected me very deeply was, and this is something that exists all over the world, which has to do with the lack of women's status in society, is that it shocked me on the few times that I went to the women's jail on Visitors' Day, was to see that nobody would go and visit the women prisoners. There would be, you know, queues and queues of people in line to visit the men, but very few people would go and visit the women.
Because they were so stigmatized?
Because if you're a woman, you have no status. But then if on top of it, you're a woman in jail, you have absolutely no status whatsoever within society. And so it's been very interesting in my travels is that I find that this happens to be a universal situation, that women prisoners are not visited as much as male prisoners, or hardly at all. And I found that very sad and very moving. And then the voice of the protagonist, whose name is Lady Di Garcia Martinez, her voice came to me. And so the novel really took off when I heard her voice inside of me.
As a result of hearing so many voices in
Exactly.
the research and
Yeah.
everything.
Yeah.
Well, you mentioned Guerrero. That was a big part of this story and of your research, and I've been spending a lot of time there lately with everything that's going on. Mm-hmm. What is it about Guerrero? Why do you think that exemplifies so many of these problems we're seeing, and in particular that it's become sort of a hub for sex trafficking of women?
Well, I think it has to do with the fact that there's a lawlessness, and there's impunity in all kinds of areas, be it corruption, be it trafficking of young girls, be it just disappearing people. I mean, one of the things that's come to light with all the violence that's happening there today is how many people are disappeared, and they're finding all these mass graves all over the place. So it's kind of a state that I think one could describe as lawless, and so all kinds of crimes can be committed there with no consequences.
Mm-hmm. And we've certainly seen an increase in that since these last years of the war on drugs. As you mentioned, the same kind of increase in the attacks on journalists. What's the relationship there? Why are we seeing such a spike in violence?
Well, I think it has to do with many issues. Certainly, I'm not an expert on this. I'm a novelist, I'm a poet, but from what I can see is this sort of attack on the drug cartels, which aren't really drug cartels at this point. We could call them, transnational criminal organizations, because they actually are operating in many areas of criminality. But I think that one thing that one cannot put to one side is the role of the United States also in what's happening in Mexico. So it's very complicated. But certainly the consumption of drugs is in the United States, and the Mexicans are being armed by guns that are coming from the United States, be it illegal or legal arms that cross the border into Mexico. And so it's definitely a kind of a terrible marriage that both these countries have to solve together.
Well, it's clear that over 11 years you've seen some of those changes, which made me wonder about what you thought might be behind them. But I wanted to go back to a phrase you mentioned earlier, which is the poetry of these experiences, and how words and that concept of poetry comes into it. Could you explain that to us just a little bit more?
I guess, I even have a little trouble with the word research, because it sounds so scientific and cold, because as I said earlier, I enter with, I'm looking for the poetic experience. And so I guess when I think of this book, Prayers for the Stolen, and one of the things that the critics have said about the book is that it's a book that's full of enchantment. So even though it's a book about a very difficult subject, thanks to the poetry in the book, it has this enchanted quality. And I think when I think of the poetry, I guess if I would have to define it, it's a bit hard because it's kind of mysterious, but I think I would say that I'm always interested in how the divine exists with the profane, and how beauty coexists or exists side by side with ugliness. So I'm looking for the divine, and I'm looking for beauty even in the most terrible places. That's what I'm looking for.
And you found it, obviously, because there are moments in the book where it really shines through. Mm-hmm. I think that's so important for a world where the ugliness is portrayed constantly.
Yeah, and I think also for me, Prayers for the Stolen, it's a kind of a requiem, because I really love Mexico. It's my home. I grew up here, and as a child and as an adolescent and even as an adult, I used to spend tons of time in the state of Guerrero. I really know that state very well. So there is this element of requiem in the book.
And there's some parts that can give us hope through all this as well. We're going to take another short break, and we'll be right back with Jennifer Clement.
Was kind to the flowers and the leaves. He cupped the roses with his hands as if he were honored to hold them. He twirled vines between his fingers as if they were locks of hair. He walked gently on the grass as if he did not want the small blades to break or even bend under his weight. Plants in my life had always been something to fight against. Trees were filled with tarantulas, vines strangled everything. Large red ants lived under roots, and snakes hid near the prettiest flowers.
Welcome back. We're here in the Octavio Paz bookstore talking to Jennifer Clement about her recent work. Jennifer, you mentioned that you were president of PEN for a period of 3 years, and also that there was some dangers in the work you did. Have you ever personally faced danger or felt a threat to your own freedom of expression?
Well, I mean, things have happened that I wouldn't be able to define, to be sure. I wouldn't be able to know if it was sort of petty crime or intentional. I mean, it would be hard for me to define that. But I would probably have to say that I just felt that I needed to be careful, which is what most people feel when they're doing these things.
Yeah, there are protocols and a whole series of actions. It's become a very different thing to be a journalist and even to be a fiction writer with some of these issues in Mexico lately. Now, I wanted to turn to the impact of the novels and the work that you do. Do you have an idea of what you would like the reader to feel, or what do you hope to accomplish, especially when you're treating these very thorny social issues like sex trafficking or the secret lives of domestic workers here in Mexico?
Well, I mean, I'm writing about things that won't let go of me, things that hurt me, things that keep me up at night. And, you know, I think there are people out there that feel the same way. And so the thing that's been the big surprise about these books is that they have been published all over the world, and people are interested in what is happening with women in Mexico. And the other thing that I think I mentioned a bit earlier is this realization that these themes are universal themes, that these are problems that we have to face in the world today, in the 21st century.
That's one thing that comes clear, and I think it's one of the advantages that fiction and novels have to nonfiction writing, in the sense that they can, through this focus on their people, you know, transcend the specific context, and then of course the tragedy that something like sex trafficking or the other issues that you've written about are in fact worldwide and not just here in Mexico. You said once in an interview that you believe that literature can change the world. Do you still believe that, and why?
I do believe that, because if you look at history, there are novels that have changed the world. So I do believe so.
You mentioned some of those earlier that came at a time when there was a serious social problem, that portrayed it through fictional characters, but in such a way that people realized that they were really reading something that was happening all around them. Do you think we might be at a moment here in Mexico when that kind of thing could happen?
I do think so. I think it's not only literature. I think all the arts have a place to play in important social issues.
Well, we're seeing that there's an explosion of young people, especially youth, that are using art, such as murals and paintings and other types of expression. Now, with the situation in Guerrero, there have been theater groups that are doing like flash performances and that kind of thing. And so it does seem to be coming much more into what was formerly kind of more restricted as social activism. Are you going to continue this vein, or what do you think your next project will be?
I'm a little superstitious, so I don't like to talk about it, but yes, absolutely. It will be, maybe not this exact vein, but it will be a book about things that matter to me deeply and that worry me. Yes.
I think that one of the things that really come through in your work is this connection, the personal connection with the subject matter. And that's one of the reasons that the books have had so much resonance. And there have been so many prizes that have been won, as you say, they've been translated into languages throughout the world. And that capacity to communicate what you're feeling, to connect it to the realities that you're seeing, is certainly a gift and a talent. Well, Jennifer, thank you very much for being with us here on Interview from Mexico. And thank you for joining us. I'm Laura Carlson, and we'll be back next week on Interview from Mexico.